My name is Luke Kramer. I currently substitute teach down in Arcadia Independence area, for those of you who know what that is. I also work here in the meantime and study historical fencing and historical martial arts with the Wisconsin Historical Fencing Association. So I've been doing that since my sophomore year of high school, so about 8 years now. I graduated from Notre Dame in 2010 with a geology degree. But so this is really more of a very long time, life-consuming hobby, if you can think of it that way. So the presentation tonight is called From Steel to Fire, and it's kind of an overview of arms and armor development in Western Europe from the Roman Empire through the 17th century, which coincidentally is the time period that the museum here covers. I did that on purpose. The reason we do it that way is because that kind of documents what people think of as the Middle Ages. It was a time that was very formative to our culture, since most of you are of probably German, Polish, Swedish, Swiss descent. That's, Western Europe, except for Poland. So this is actually, whether you realize it or not, a very important time in our own culture. That's why I got interested in it, because I knew that my roots, definitely went back before the American Revolution. Even though you might not be able to trace them that far, that's where they are. So I was more interested in how that came to be. Now the downside to this is that you're looking at, fall of the Roman Empire around 400, circa 400 AD, through the 17th century, which is the 1600s. You're looking at 1,200 years of history. That's a long time. So we're going to try and go through the whole thing, just kind of give a really large overview of everything that happened, where certain things came up, how it developed, so that should you come back to the museum again, you can look at these things and be able to figure out where they fit into each period of history and why they were that way. Why were pikes popular in the High Renaissance, the early modern period? Why weren't there very large swords back in the Viking era? So hopefully we put some of these in context, blast away some misconceptions from the time period, and that's what we're going to do. So without further ado, we will move on from there to the next slide.
Oh, okay.
And
yep, hang on, there we go.
Yes. So the way I'm trying to do this, like I said, very large period of history to cover, lots of stuff going on. So I had to try and break it down. It's very difficult. I apologize in advance for missing something that you think I should discuss as important, or making overgeneralizations. I promise I do it all in the interest of just trying to get people aware of the big picture and how these things develop. We're going to do this just kind of looking at a snapshot of some significant battles and what was common at that time period, what was not common, and what things changed in between those battles. They're spaced off more or less by century later on. The earlier battles are further apart because there's less information to go on from those time periods. Things seem to develop a little less quickly there. So we'll go through all of those battles, and then in between we'll talk about the different warrior cultures that cropped up in between, because they're very indicative of how people were fighting that time. I say warrior cultures because some of them are knightly organizations, some of them were monastic organizations, some of them were just people who wanted to make a living for themselves by robbing other people, and some of them were conscripted soldiers. So they're very different in background, but they all kind of share the warrior ethos type pathology. So they're all kind of included as an introspective as how certain people at certain time periods were thinking in terms of warfare and combat. On the next slide, we're going to also in between try and look at the details of what's going on. Look at the different classes of weapons that you will see, I'm sure have already seen on display at the museum. Swords, daggers and knives, pole arms. For those of you who are not sure, pole arm generally is anything on a long stick. And then spears and bows. Spear, of course, being one of the oldest weapons, and as you're going to find out, one of the best melee weapons ever invented, ironically enough. And bows basically being a very small spear that someone got a machine to throw for them. So they're basically very closely related. And then we're also going to look at different types of armor and the relationships between the arms and armor. You'll notice that the arms develop a little bit faster than the armor, and the armor's always start trying to play catch-up to stop the pain that the weapons are inflicting. Of course, you got to start by talking about mail, because it's one of the oldest ones and also one of the most prevalent in the time period. organic armor, which people don't actually get a lot of exposure to. Organic armor is stuff that's made of natural materials, plant fibers, animal hides, things like that. Our Swiss halberdier over there is actually wearing a good example of organic armor. That would be called a gambeson. And it kind of fits a very interesting niche because you were always used to seeing all the metal armor that came out of Europe. Well, metal armor was hard to care for and was expensive, so depending on how much money you had, maybe you couldn't afford it, or maybe you're a commoner and you just didn't have a prayer of getting your hands on any to begin with. Your best choice was fabric armor, which was a decent alternative, obviously not quite as good, but better than nothing. And then, of course, plate armor. Because we can talk about where plate armor is, where it came from, and why we're not calling it plate mail for some people who are still caught up into that line of thinking. And a very brief talk about horses and artillery, because they're kind of round out the whole picture. Knights were almost always mounted soldiers, so horses were very important to them. And artillery was more of the infantry domain, thus common engineers would actually come up with different artillery mechanisms, and they wanted to play a more and more important part of warfare as we progress into the Renaissance and late into the early modern period. So, if we are still awake at that time, we will then go into the present, talk about how people are trying to revive some of these fighting arts that are known as collect under the umbrella term of HEMA, Historical European Martial Arts, and very briefly what that all entails. So, before we do that, let's just talk about whatever's on the next slide, which is trends to watch. When we're going through this, I want you guys to pay attention to certain things that you're going to see. Weapon effectiveness, what weapons are effective and why. I'm going to do my best to point these things out so you can see how these things kind of flowed into one another. We started with slashing weapons, eventually changed it to more pointed weapons as the armor got harder and harder to cut through. That was just one example of things that we will be looking at. Tactics and strategies varied wildly between the time periods. You'll get to see kind of an interesting trend. We start with the big blocks, huge blocks of Roman armies. You know, they fought in the phalanx formation. They're a very tight-knit formation. That will then get thrown out for a slightly less organized type of fighting, where there was more fast-moving cavalry that needed to go all over the place in the battlefield. And then, sure enough, in a few hundred years, we come full circle. We're back in tight-knit pike block formations that are fundamentally different, yet still a little similar to the old Roman phalanx. And also the cavalry versus infantry. Who has the upper hand? Who does what? You'll see that infantry was basically the Roman way of doing things. They weren't too big into cavalry. They had some horse-drawn chariots, and they were met with moderate enthusiasm on the battlefield. They were all about infantry. Then we go back to cavalry, and then several hundred years later, the power kind of shifts back into infantry, and you'll hopefully get to see why that happened. And then, of course, you can't talk about the time period without talking about all of the various and sundry things people think they know, but they're actually always completely wrong about. For example, the actual physical properties of the arms and armor themselves. How much it weighs, how it works, how it was put on. Can you get back up after you fall over? These are all very important things that people need to look at. You'll see that the design is very good. Also, ownership is also called into question. People always think, oh, well, knights had swords, knights had armor, everyone else, I guess, fought with sticks. That's not always the case. It's a little bit more complicated. We'll also look at who owned what pieces of armor and what time period. You'll also see that they actually did have a very good knowledge of what they were doing combat-wise and on a very personal level with the martial arts system. They weren't just going out there in their big heavy metal suits swinging these big metal clubs around. They actually did have a method to their madness. They did know what they were doing. The chronology is often misconstrued. Everyone thinks of medieval knights and they immediately think of Max upstairs, right? The big suit of armor in the middle of the room. Well, it didn't quite come out that way. The first knights looked wildly different from Max, and you'll get to see how they transition into that appearance. And finally, sort of a brief note, the role of women. Of course, it's always assumed, this was medieval Europe. This was men's, Roman Catholic Church. This was men's territory, very patronistic. Not exactly the case. There were women warriors. They did exist. We're not entirely sure about how many and how widespread they were, but it's worth mentioning that there is evidence to show that women possibly did train in combat, like the men did, at least early on in the time period. So, of course, you come to a museum like this because you want to see a sword, right? People love swords. Swords are possibly, and I might be a little biased, one of the coolest weapons ever invented. And people always like to think of these battles where two large groups of people get together and they charge at each other with their swords drawn, and they're just waiting in the battle, hacking and slashing away. But that's not exactly what a sword was for. A sword was actually more like a modern military sidearm, kind of like an officer's service revolver. A sword was never a primary battlefield weapon, ever, with one very rare exception, as I talked about earlier with Frank, wherever he is floating around here. The Spanish did actually field a unit of troops that did primarily use swords, but that's very much a rarity. If you were a knight, a mounted soldier, you would have a lance or a spear as your primary weapon, because that's most useful from horseback. If you were an infantryman, depending on the time period, you'd either have whatever you picked up from your local farm to fend off your enemies, or later on you'd get halberds and spears, pikes, and things like that. However, these weapons, they were made of wood, they were very large, they got dropped, they were broken, you need to have something to fall back on, just like today in modern military, you might lose your rifle or run out of ammunition, so you're left with your sidearm. That's what the sword was for. Then the sword would come out. The sword got to be that way because it was a very versatile weapon. A sword is capable of doing what the medieval masters called all four wounding attacks: bludgeoning, piercing, slashing, and slicing, with relatively equal adeptness. Also important to note, the sword was actually a chivalric ideal. It was a status symbol. Swords were very hard to make. We don't have a concept of that right now because we don't really get the chance to hold swords very often. They look like kind of a big sharp piece of metal, but they're actually much more than that. There's a lot of nowadays very intense physics that went into the making of swords that we're still trying to completely understand, but smiths back then had been able to acquire through hundreds of years of practice and innovation. So they are very expensive. Also, steel at that time period was very expensive. So they were relatively difficult to make. Not just anyone could go out and buy a sword. Most people didn't have that kind of money. Usually the people who owned swords are people who did warfare for a living and had the money to afford it. That's where the knights come from. So the sword from very early on was associated with knighthood, with the section of nobility that was basically hired to be your military elite. So it had a very prestigious aura surrounding it, and that aura persisted into the modern day, to modern fantasy, where swords are still considered to be one of the top weapons that people always like to romanticize about. But there are plenty of other weapons too. Most of these weapons were inherited from the Romans. The Romans were, pretty good at warfare. They did conquer most of Europe and a good chunk of Asia as well, and Africa. So we got a lot. Latin Europe borrowed a lot of weapons from the old Roman tactics. They had spears and bows to begin with. Romans were familiar with archery, and of course they loved spears because spears are great from a phalanx formation. The Romans would get into a nice tight block there, and they'd have their very large shields all pushed right up against each other to form a very large shield wall. And they'd advance on their foes like that. And then, of course, in the gaps between the shields, that's when they'd stick their spears out and draw them back again. So it was a very effective form of fighting for the time period, and the Romans had it down to a science. And so they were great with their spears. Spears, as I mentioned before, one of the very first weapons people invented. Whenever someone said back in the Stone Age, hey, I should put a sharp piece of rock on my stick, I bet you it would work better. Ipso facto, you have a spear. It would then survive through pretty much every era of combat. The Romans still used spears. Survived into the medieval period as once again, the spear later on would become a lance, which is basically a specialized spear. Pikes, another type of spear. Halberds actually have a pointy end on them, so they can act like spears. And into the modern period, once we had muskets and gunpowder, they still had bayonets on them, which is a spear. And And even today, I'm not entirely sure of this, but I'm still pretty sure that there are bayonet-type attachments for modern tactical assault rifles, which just shows that when you get in close quarters combat, it's just a really good thing to have. Also, a little bit less effective is the club. Club is the easiest weapon to make. People like it because you can just swing it and it hits people and it hurts. You don't have to spend a lot of time learning about how it works. And of course, the club would be in various forms resurrected all throughout the Middle Ages, most commonly known as the mace, as I'm sure a lot of you have heard of. So we'll get to see some of those as well. And then, of course, they inherited various sorts of metal tools from the Romans. You know, knives for day-to-day life, eating, tanning leather, whatever you'd use a knife for, and axes, of course, for chopping up wood, breaking up various things like that. So all of these things here, which came from the Romans, would eventually be turned into some sort of weapon. The reason for that is because feudal Europe was just rife with war, and when you have an area that's rife with war, lots of combat happening, you naturally look for lots of innovations. So, now we move on to the actual evolution of all these things, starting with the Battle of Adrianople in 378. Relatively arbitrary choice for battles. Just so let you know, I have all the information about the battle kind of up here on the slide. I'm really more interested in is what the armors and the weapons are doing at each battle. So I'm really going to highlight more and leave the reading of the actual historical details up to you guys, because you could probably spend easily 45 minutes in each of these battles, and I really don't think we want that. So, looking here, the reason I picked Battle of Adrianople is because it was a very bizarre situation. The Goths had managed to cross into Roman territory, and they raised a ruckus and were causing trouble, and eventually the Romans decided it was time to kick the Goths out. The Goths were a Germanic tribe of barbarians. So they sent a Roman army to expel the Goths. They went up there and they found the Goths camped in their classic formation, I got it written down here, the lager, which is a big ring of encampments, where everyone would be looking outside the ring so they would be able to see anyone coming. It served as an encampment and a scouting unit at the same time. The Romans thought, oh, this will be easy. We'll go in, march in on the lager, break it up, go home, drink some wine, and have the rest of the day off. So they advanced on the lager, and they were sure enough started beating them. Unfortunately, what they didn't count on was, ironically, the Goths actually had a cavalry as well. And this cavalry was off in the distance grazing their horses on a grassy knoll somewhere, just a little bit out of sight. So they're sitting there, they heard screams and stuff coming from the lager, and they decided to ride back and check it out, and they found all these Romans there. So the cavalry charged in, and after that things did not go very well for the Romans. Because a phalanx, as a lot of you may have figured out, is not very good when it's flanked, especially by a fast-moving unit such as a guy on a horseback. So this was kind of the start of when things went bad for Rome. Not too long after that, we'd have the official downfall of the Roman Empire. Also, the interesting thing about this battle is that a lot of people think it was the beginning of heavy cavalry in Europe. Like I said, the Romans were not very big into cavalry. They really didn't need it. But then they get whipped by these barbarian tribes, which the Romans did not consider the barbarians anywhere near their superiors, not even their equals. Yet these guys rode on their horses and were able to butcher them left and right. So people started to realize that, hey, maybe this cavalry thing might catch on a little bit. This picture is pretty good in terms of accuracy. You see the Roman guy there is wearing a type of armor called lorica squamata, which is basically lots of little metal scales sewn into a leather jacket. It allows him flexibility. Unfortunately, it just kind of hangs his dead weight off his shoulders, so if you get surrounded, you can't really, broken up from your formation, you can't really move around all as easily as you could with some of the later, more sophisticated armors we'll see later. And the Germans, the Goths on the other hand, they're not wearing a whole lot of armor. They're wearing mostly fabric armor, layers of padding like we talked about before. They did actually have a very early form of mail, of chain mail like that. Very loose, not quite as tightly woven as that would have been. People actually think, interestingly enough, that the mail was actually invented by the Celts in France, the Gauls. So that invention actually might have come from outside the Roman Empire, which would be pretty interesting because the Romans did not consider these peoples to be very intelligent. But not everyone had that, so these particular barbarians were wading in with lots and lots of cloth on top of itself. One of them's got a spear, weapon of choice if you're riding a horse. The other guy, has a club. Swords were not very widespread amongst the barbarian tribes at this time. Rome did have a sword, of course, the Roman gladius, which you'll actually have a picture of in the next slide. And that's one on the side. Good example of Roman gladius. The Germanic peoples did have a sword. It would have looked like that, but they're very, very rare. There was an archaeological dig of an actual sunken Germanic warship from around the time period that had these swords on it. However, when they counted up how many remains they found and how many swords they had, they theorized that there's only about one sword per every 20 or 30 Goths. So they were very rare. Over here we can see sort of what's left of a piece of lorica squamata. Lorica is just Latin for armor, so it's not any fancy term that the Romans used. They just called their armor, and then had an adjective to tell what type of armor it was. Squamata means scales or flattened pieces of whatever, so that's lorica squamata. They also had a very early ring armor that looked very similar to mail, like that. And they also had a series of very long, flat metal plates kind of sewn on top of each other. That was called lorica segmentata. And so the Romans were very well equipped, and the Goths would not quite catch on to armor for quite some time, unfortunately. Also, just a sort of a note, I have chosen for a lot of my pictures to use, you'll see that those are obviously not artifacts. They're quite recent, actually. They were made by, those two swords on the very far right were made by Albion Swords in New Glarus, Wisconsin. Very talented group of people. I've chosen to show, for the most part, modern reproductions of weapons, just to kind of so we get to see what they looked like when they might have looked like when they were new, because we're used to seeing these weapons in their very deteriorated state. So this way, we get just a chance to see what they might have looked like in their functional state. And I have chosen Albion swords as well as Arms and Armor and a few other places I know, because I do know that they do very historically accurate reproductions. So that is more or less a good depiction of them. So after the Roman Empire broke up, Europe lost its big central government. The Romans were very good at keeping order of things. Once they were gone, they had a less good time keeping track of things. So all of the various tribes throughout Europe kind of scattered and went their own separate ways. They kind of huddled around these very small bands or tribes and stuff. And it would stay that way for a few hundred years until the Carolingians actually managed to form their own little kingdom around what would become modern-day France. Charlemagne would be one of the best-known examples of that line of kings. And Charlemagne actually was very famous for two things. One, he united a bunch of Frankish kingdoms to form one very large kingdom. And two, he liked to go out and fight against Muslims a lot. One of his more famous conquests was in the Iberian Peninsula in Spain, out there attacking what were the Moors, the Spanish Muslims. He did succeed in driving them pretty far down the Iberian Peninsula. However, he did suffer one relatively well-known defeat at the Battle of Roncesvalles Pass, which is one of a very small mountain pass in the Pyrenees, the mountain range separating France and Spain. When you got a big army at this time period, you got all these people on horseback, and you have all the people from their household that they brought to the forefront as well, and you have all of the horses and carts full of their baggage. It's a lot of things to transport. So when you're faced with crossing a mountain range, you don't have a whole lot of options as to where you can go. So Roncesvalles Pass is really one of the only crossing routes that Charlemagne could take. He did manage to take off a small village, and that small village knew that Charlemagne would have to cross through Roncesvalles Pass, so they set up an ambush. They attacked the very tail of Charlemagne's army, since they had to spread out in this very long column in order to get through that narrow pass. They attacked the tail, the rest of the army couldn't get back to help them, and that was one of the more decisive defeats Charlemagne ever had. It was none of his people back in that last unit had survived, including the very famous Roland, who was a good friend and captain of his. And the whole tale is somewhat retold in the old French epic, The Song of Roland, somewhat inaccurately, but they're really more interested in talking about all the great things that Roland did as he was dying. So historical accuracy was not very big for those people. And this actually, interesting enough, is a picture of someone depicting the Roncevaux Pass. This picture was actually done in the 14th century. Now, as you can see, the battle happened in the 8th century, so that's a pretty big gap of time between when it happened and when someone made this very nice picture. And because of that, you'll see lots of things that actually didn't exist in this time period. You see these conical Norman helmets. They didn't have those. You see the small square, what are called heater shields, which are what people think of always. The first thing they think of when they think of medieval shields, they always think of that thing right there, heater shield. Didn't have that back then. And they didn't even have these surcoats back then either. They didn't even have heraldry. So the whole thing where knights would, have pictures representing their own coat of arms didn't even exist then. Those are all things that came about later. And this is one thing that people should always be aware of when they look at period pictures, is that when people depict a scene from history, at least in the medieval period, they didn't actually put that right period imagery in with what it was supposed to be. They instead would put contemporary images. So these are all things that actually had come about by the 14th century. So they drew Charlemagne's knights as having all of these modern things that they actually didn't have all those years ago. So that's just one thing to kind of be aware of. But, and by the way, this is the last time I'm going to trick you like that. That was kind of mean. However, Charlemagne did do one important thing. He established a military group called the Paladins. And the Paladins were effectively what we could call the very first order of knighthood. Which brings us to the whole topic of knighthood. Which is, like everything else you're going to hear, a little bit more complicated than we think it is. A knight, in essence, was a nobleman whose job it was to fight in battles. Because of that, the very higher noblemen, the kings and the dukes and stuff, didn't always want to involve themselves in battles. They had more important things to do, so they usually hired the lower level nobility to do that fighting for them. So generally when we think of knight, what we're picturing is this kind of lower echelon of nobility who made it basically their lifestyle to go to war. They were an important social class, and they were very much a warrior culture. They also were not the only warrior culture. It seems to be that very rich fighting peoples is just sort of a common theme that crops up all around the world at this time period. Because you have people who are farming the land, living in this agrarian society, and you have a need to defend that land. So you get this idea of warrior cultures. Other examples, the Japanese samurai, very similar to this. They were also nobility who fought in warfare. The Indian Kshatriya, another example, and also the Chinese, and I'm pretty sure I'm going to mispronounce this, Wuxia, are traveling warriors, were all examples of this sort of landed nobility that were dedicating themselves to fighting during this time period. Because they made their career in military, knights pretty much spent all of their money on military equipment. So if you want to see what the cutting edge weapons or armor was at the time period, you had to look at the knights. And you usually had to look at a little bit top of that bottom half of the scale, because the poorest knights couldn't afford all the good stuff. It was a little bit expensive. So, but they did sink as much money towards that as they could. They actually did, of course, adopt a code of chivalry. Everyone knows about the chivalrous knights and things like that. But that didn't come around Charlemagne's time. That was a creation that would happen much later, when they needed to kind of control the egos of the knights a little bit. Another thing about knights is that not every knight called themselves a knight. Knight is an English term. Knecht is a German term, which they believe are related. And chevalier is a French term. All basically mean the same thing. That's all what we think of as knights. But depending on what area you're in, what language they're speaking, what their customs are, they may or may not have actually called themselves a knight. Aside from being obviously a good bulk of the military at this time period, they're also a good cornerstone of economy. The way the feudal system worked was that nobility would promise their allegiance to a more powerful ruler. He would fight whatever battles that ruler told him to, and in turn, should his land be attacked, he wouldn't have to go out there by himself and defend it. The the king would throw some other soldiers his way. It was a good system for the time period, but as time's going on and the kingdoms got bigger and more complicated, it started to be a big tangled mess. There was no limit to how many oaths of fealty you could swear, so you could be promising loyalty to all these different rulers. And then, of course, if they both requested you for battle at the same time, you had to try and figure out which one you would be able to go to. And if they're fighting each other, well, then we don't want to even get into that. But the knights, these lower nobility, go kind of up the social period. They were kind of the bulk of these of this relationship. That all kind of hinged on how they performed. Also, what's important is that in return for swearing an oath of loyalty, for granting fealty, the higher-ranking ruler would give that knight what's called a fiefdom, or a fief, a small plot of land that was basically his. So the knight would get his own plot of land. He wouldn't work it himself, of course. That fiefdom and whatever farmers were living on it, were sold with the land. Those were the serfs. The serfs would live in the land and work it for the knight. And if there were any free peoples, they would be allowed to work in that knight's land too, and then he would collect a tax from them. And that tax on goods was, he kept some for himself, obviously, and sold the rest to others. And that was the money he used to basically fund his equipment, his military campaigns. So, after this, knighthood is well established with Charlemagne. We have a blank slide that I forgot to delete. All right, moving on. Sorry about that. We also have around the time Charlemagne gets his act together, gets his paladins fielded. A little bit after that, we have the Vikings coming along. And the Vikings and Charlemagne were not very good friends with each other. Vikings, not exactly known for their chivalry. The important thing to mention about the Vikings is they were actually not a group of people, an ethnic group. They were actually, it was an occupation. Not every Norseman was a Viking. Viking was something that Norsemen did. They would go Viking. The reason this came about is because the Norse, like most people, were very agricultural. They had lots of farms. Unfortunately, like most peoples, the Norse would have more than one son. The firstborn son would get all the farm, leaving the second and third, and maybe and fourthborn son without really a source of income. So, instead of developing the whole fealty system, the whole feudal system, the other sons decided they're just going to go and borrow wealth from everyone else. Despite this, within the old Viking culture, they actually did have very strict rules. They actually had basically very rudimentary contracts that said who got what shares of the loot, and if you died, so much of your share went back to your family to compensate for your loss. So they did have actually some very strict rules. They're also very intelligent. People like to think of Vikings as being rather big and brutish, but they, as a lot of us now know, they sailed across the Atlantic Ocean to Iceland, and then to Greenland, and then to North America in a time when most people couldn't even sail out of sight of land. So they were very good at navigation. I'm not exactly sure how they were able to navigate so well, but they were very good at it. And they actually used some very large shields for combat. Now, this is sort of a bizarre thing. May or may not have actually been a cast-off from the old Roman fighting style, but the way a Viking fought was they had a very large wooden shield with a central boss. That's that part that's kind of is bumped out in the middle. And whenever we think of shields, we like to think of the back of the shield as having two straps, and you kind of feed your forearm to that strap, and you hold it close to your body and fend off blows like that. But that's actually not how Viking shields worked at all. They had one handhold in the very center of the shield. So you grip that shield right in the center with one hand, and you would actually hold it along the top of your arm so that the edge of your shield stuck out in front of you. And you'd hold it out like that while holding your weapon back here getting ready to attack. Now, this was, once you think about it, a lot more effective than just holding it like this, because instead of having your enemy right here, your enemy's out there a little ways. It gives you a little bit of breathing room. Not a whole lot is known as exactly how the Viking combat system worked, but from what we've been able to piece together, we think that was sort of a game where they would kind of dance around and try and work in blows either under and over or around their shield whenever their opponent left an opening. And of course, you'll notice right away this Viking is not wearing any horns. We used to scream about Vikings not having horns. Now it's Actually, there's been a recent find of a helm that actually did have bronze horns on it. So now all of the academics get to eat a little crow. However, maybe not quite yet, because that horn may have actually been Gallic in origin, not Viking, so maybe we can save face a little bit. So, the Vikings, of course, invaded lots of places in Europe, including the beaches in Normandy and France. Once they conquered some land, they were able to settle down a little bit, start their own farms, which is really all a Viking wanted to do in the first place. So you know that comic strip, Hagar the Horrible, where like goes home to his wife all the time and is trying to like run places. It's actually kind of what Vikings did like to do in their spare time. And then of course, Vikings took Frankish wives, Franks being the early French people in that area. They intermarried with these people and they formed a whole new group of people called the Normans. So the Normans were kind of occupying that area of northern France. They actually laid down a lot of things. They expanded on the whole knighthood thing. They also made sure that their people were riding horses, as you can see in this picture here. And however, they still had a little bit of Viking blood in them. They liked to go out and they liked to conquer things. So, on 14th of October in 1066, the Normans had succeeded in taking over England in a very famous battle known as the Battle of Hastings. The Battle of Hastings, by the way, is probably one of the most important battles the world has ever seen. It is still affecting property taxes in England to this day by about 10%. So, it was a very, very big deal at this time, and even nowadays. Also, it was a very big deal for the ruler of the Normans, who is William, who had the unfortunate mishap of being born out of wedlock, and therefore his official title was William the Bastard. But, after successfully taking England, now he's William the Conqueror. So, things worked out well for him too. And of course, the biggest part of this was now England was part of Normandy, and all of the English social structure is restructured. England actually did not have what we would call a knight. They didn't have this social group of warriors called knights. They did have noblemen who were fighting, but they weren't really structured the same way. They didn't have the same type of system that the Normans had. So the Normans effectively brought knighthood to England. That was also an important part of that whole conquest. And this actually this picture down here is actually a piece of what's known as the Bayeux Tapestry. It's not a picture at all, it's actually a piece of fabric, a very long cloth that someone knit. The whole thing is over 200 feet long. It tells the whole story of the Norman conquest of England. And on the next slide, I have a bigger version of it. There we go, that's much better. You can kind of see now what the Norman armies would look like. Now this was actually made shortly after the conquest, so it is period accurate. This wasn't made, several hundred years in the future where they would throw their own changes onto it. This is more or less what a Norman army would look like. They had these sort of conical helms made of one piece of metal kind of folded around with a nose guard. It's known as a Norman helm. They had these very large shields, usually made of wood, sometimes covered with leather. And then they had mail. Except this guy, I'm not sure what he's wearing. It looks like he's wearing an Afghan or something. Like I said before, not all the knights could afford, top-of-the-line equipment, so it's quite possible he's wearing a quilt. Quilted armor was indeed in place this time period. It's in all likelihood that it was that way. Or maybe the guy who was trying to stitch this whole tapestry together just got sick of trying to stitch together rings and just did that instead. We're not sure. But as you see these Normans ride into battle here, you notice that they have spears, they have very big clubs, and they have these large shields. What is noticeably absent from this picture is any sword whatsoever. Now we know the Normans had swords, because this was after Charlemagne, and we know Charlemagne had a very famous sword called Joyeux. So we know the swords existed, but once again this kind of reaffirms that swords were not a primary battlefield weapon. Swords weren't going to come out until that spear was broken, that club was dropped, and that other spear was also broken. Then the swords would come out. So we kind of get a sort of a snapshot of the early Normans in battle, and we also get to see some good example of mounted combat. Famously, the English nobility, wearing all their armor and stuff, were not mounted. They preferred to fight on foot. They didn't do quite as well. They held off for a while, but then the Normans actually tricked them by faking a retreat on horseback. The English like, hey, they're retreating, let's go get them. And then they came back with more people and surrounded them. So after that, England would also start fielding more and more mounted soldiers. So, after that, things would kind of move on from there. Now England also had Norman blood mixed in with it. We would actually get to a later period where knights would get a little bit more and more restless. There was less fighting for them to do. Remember, they made their career fighting, so they wanted to be fighting. And kind of the 10th, or the 11th and 12th centuries, we start to see a very important change now. Now we actually start to see more and more big explosion of literature. So people are writing more things down. Because of that, we actually have a lot more information about this time period forward than we did about all the stuff that happened before. A lot of that is conjecture. Now we actually have lots of more written documentation about what's going on. We also get to see the knights starting to look a little bit more like what we expect them to, but we're not quite there yet. Good example of this with the coming of the First Crusade, of course, which was in the late 11th century, very late 11th century, practically in the 12th century. The Knights Templar, a very famous group of knights that everyone has heard of. They were basically monks whose job was to protect people who were traveling from Europe to the Holy Land on a pilgrimage. Because, you know, lots of nobility like to go to go to Jerusalem and pay homage to all the different historical sites there, because they were very Christian, and they wanted to show their people that they were very Christian so that they would continue to follow them. And since these noblemen were walking along carrying all their expensive stuff, they would get robbed a lot of times. And of course, once you got to the Holy Land, there were also Saracen raiders and things like that. So they need to have some sort of bodyguards. So the Knights Templar forms an organization of basically free bodyguards that would just patrol the roads on the way to the Holy Land and make sure that everyone stayed safe. Later on, however, they started accepting as a sort of a service. They actually would take all of the riches and wealth of the nobility that were making the pilgrimage and hold on to it till they got back, so that nothing would happen to it. They'd keep it in their monastery so that the nobility could travel to Jerusalem. They wouldn't have anything of value on them, which makes them less of a target, and then they could pick up all their valuables when they got back. This would grow into what would become the first real banking system in Europe, and they got quite good at it. They eventually started giving out loans, started making more and more money, and of course they had so much money that the kings were getting a little bit uneasy about whether or not they would challenge their authority. So they launched this very large campaign, slander campaign against them, saying that they were all devil worshippers and that they summoned demons and that they were all sodomists and all sorts of just awful things to say about the Knights Templar, which eventually ended in their disbandment and the execution of the Grand Master of the Order, Jacques de Molay, at 1314. So, Knights Templar ended in the 14th century, did not continue in the modern days. I know that some popular culture media has hinted at. But they were a very supreme fighting force at the time. You can see a few differences here. We see they still have their fairly Norman-looking helms. We still have the really big shields, but now he's wearing a surcoat. That surcoat is actually came along in the 11th and 12th centuries when they started developing heraldry, a system of pictures to help identify different knights in the battlefield. They would wear these pictures on them so that people know who they are. For example, if you're wearing a white, tunic with a red cross on it, people knew you were a member of the Templar Order. So those kind of came about with themselves. The heraldry is kind of a direct result of this big explosion in literature and documentation that came about. People got obsessed with keeping record of these things. Also, we see the swords are getting longer. Viking swords were not very big. They're only about that big. They had very small crossguards, and now the crossguards are getting longer. That's because we're starting to see a slightly more sophisticated of combat that actually has more blade-on-blade parrying action, so they need those longer crossguards to help protect their hands. The shield still does come into play quite a bit, but now they're starting to use the sword and shield more in conjunction with each other rather than just have the sword kind of take a swipe whenever it can. And it's important to stress that the Knights Templar were essentially a bunch of monks who were trained as knights. On the next slide, I actually have a scan from a book that has the basic day in the life of a Knights Templar compared to the day of just general monk. And as you can see, lots of praying. Basically, they spent their day praying and fighting. That was what these monks, or that is what the Templar did, practically all day. So, we talked about a little bit heraldry and literature, a little bit more on that subject since it's rather important on the next slide. There was a small boom in literature in about the 11th century. It started to become very widespread. People started getting obsessed with writing things down, keeping record of things. We started to see some very early manuscripts being printed, how-to manuals of how certain things were done. And more importantly, for a historical standpoint, lots and lots of legal documents. That's where we get a lot of information from. They kept a record of all the rulings, all the edicts the king had delivered, all the rulings that happened, because the bishops were kind of like a court at that time, all the rulings the bishops issued, when land transferred, who was allied to who swore fealty to who. Oh, so much you'd make your head spin, trust me. Because of this, heraldry now had this was sort of the earth that heraldry had sprung up from. The idea that you can trace your lineage, that you establish a coat of arms, that was all the idea of heraldry. It was a way for nice to recognize each other on the battlefield. And it was made possible by this big explosion in literature. Also, because of this, all this record keeping, it now made it much easier for kings to keep track of larger kingdoms. Before, there was sort of a limit as to how big your kingdom could get before you started to lose track of what was going on, because the further away you get from your center of power, the harder it is to keep your eye on all the things that are going on. The Romans had a lot of problems with that. That's why Constantine actually brought Christianity to Rome, because Rome had conquered such a big territory that people weren't viewing themselves as Romans. They were viewing themselves as, for example, Gauls that were a member of the Roman Empire, or Celts that were a member of the Roman Empire. But Constantine felt that Christianity, everyone could say that they were Christian regardless of whether or not, what other culture that may be. He thought that would be essential to keeping the Roman Empire together. It didn't work, unfortunately. The Roman Empire did fall, but his motivations for that, the impact of that decision, were being felt very strongly because now we're in a time period where practically everyone is very devoutly Christian. So even though we lost a lot of the organization after the Roman Empire fell, now we're starting to get a bit of it back. The kingdoms start to get bigger and more manageable, and we'll start to see some more and more powers. As we move into the sort of the 13th and 14th centuries, unfortunately this presents problems because the kings were getting bigger, there's more and more economics being built up in these larger kingdoms, which means that you need to be able to trade with all these other peoples to maintain your abilities, which means that if someone, for example, has a very good trading port next door to you, you might want to conquer it and take that trading port away so that you can control it and make lots of wealth. That is what happened at the Battle of Visby, which is on the next slide and is indicative of what was going on. This happened in 1361. The Danish forces, the king of the Danes, actually wanted to take Gotland because it was a very good port island. They could ship a lot of things out there, it made a lot of money. So he dispatched his knights and the army to go and take it. The Goths actually didn't really have a very strong standing army. They were allied to the Swedes at the time. They appealed to the Swedes, said, hey, can you please help us? And the Swedes were a little slow fielding their army, so when the Danish forces got there, the Gotland Yemen had to fight them. Now a Yemen is not a knight. A Yemen is actually a commoner who has his freedom, so he's a freeman. He's usually a farmer. So basically you had these very highly trained career military officials fighting a bunch of farmers. And although I'm sure they put up much more of a fight than they expected, it didn't go so well for the farmers. Most of them were very soundly defeated. But this is sort of the beginning. We start to see some foot soldiers rising up against knights, a theme that is going to continue to get more and more strong as we progress from the late Middle Ages into the early Renaissance. The other thing that makes the Battle of Visby so important is that there was a major archaeological dig there that dug up a whole bunch of corpses found in mass grave that also had all these different armors on them so we could see what they were actually wearing for the time period. Here we have this poor fellow. He's modeling for us a male aventail, which was a lot of male armor that was designed to cover the head and the back of the neck and the throat. It was worn underneath the helmet. Also, they start to incorporate more and more plate armor into their defenses. Now, one thing that needs to get cleared up is people refer to mail as a word that just means armor. So they'll talk about chain mail, plate mail, scale mail, ring mail, whatever other word you want to add on to that. However, the word mail actually means a type of armor made of a metal fabric, which is basically chain, because there aren't a whole lot of other types of metal fabric. So, when you call something like that on that stand over the chain mail, you're essentially saying chain. It's a little redundant. So, generally it's referred to just as mail, and of course plate mail is just flat out the question. That would just be silly. But now what they have is they have these full mail garments, head to toe covered in mail, and they're starting to put more plate armors around it. So what they have here, these are called coats of plates, all of these. They are leather garments with iron plates, you can see the iron plates there, sewn into them. So they actually wear these heavy vests of metal plate over their mail. So you can start to see armor is getting really heavy. Also, the helmets are getting a little bit more sophisticated. You start to have the pointed bassinet type helmet, kind of like that one in the middle of that case over there, with optional attachable visor. And of course, you're still wearing the mail hauberk, which goes from your shoulders all the way down to your knees. And they also have full plate armor. Now they've developed full plate armor that can cover the legs and the arms. So, imagine kind of having this on your arms, and this stuff down here on your legs, having a full-length hauberk that goes from your shoulders to your knees, helmet on top of that, an aventail under the helmet, and then this leather vest with all these iron plates sewn onto it. This time period is about the heaviest armor got for all of European history, for very obvious reasons. Once the plate gets more and more well developed, they're going to start getting rid of some of the mail, getting rid of some of this extra stuff they realized they didn't need anymore, and armor is actually going to start getting lighter. So, Max upstairs, our big suit of armor, is actually lighter than what these people were carrying around on them at this time. Because the trend of armor was actually get heavier for a while, and then it started getting lighter after about the 14th century. And another fun fact about the Battle of Visby is, if you look at the next slide, they still reenact it every year to this day. Visby is still a town, it still exists on that island, and very much like we like to recreate Civil War battles out at Antietam and Gettysburg and all these places, the Danes like to recreate the Battle of Visby out at Visby. It's a very famous historical site. So, now we're kind of starting after Battle of Visby, we're starting to make our transition from high and late medieval into the Renaissance. So how far have we come? Well, we've come from paladins, Charlemagne's paladins wearing those mail suits and their helmets to adding surcoats and coats of arms and different types of shields. And now we're adding more and more stuff. The armor is getting more and more sophisticated. This is an example of what's called a great helm. It's made of one piece of steel kind of wrapped around with another piece riveted on top. It fits over your head kind of in one piece, kind of like a big bucket. In fact, they like to call these things bucket helms. And it was, offered 360-degree protection of both the back of your head, the sides of your heads, and your face, which was quite preferable for the time period. So they had these on top of their mail. They replaced those Norman-looking helmets with these things. They still had the mail on. They still had the surcoats and the coats of plates. We see that the swords are getting even longer, and they're having wider and wider crossguards. In fact, 14th century is when we start to see the first known fechtbuch, which is a fighting manual teaching people how to fight with different types of weapons. It comes in this time period. And also, that book actually features this type of shield here. It's a round shield. It's not very big. It's only about that big. It's called a buckler. So we went from having these very large shields to having these smaller shields. These smaller shields were more maneuverable. You would grip them actually like the Viking shields with just one hand in the center. And you could use it to push the blades out of the way, open up lines of attack, and also, it's a big sheet of metal on your hand, so you could obviously hit someone with it too. Also, it's not a very large full-body shield, so when you're not using it, you can just clip it on your belt and walk away. It's very handy to have. It gives you a little bit less cover from arrows and things like that. Arrows have been around for a long time. The English were quite adept at using Yemen archers actually in their battles. But this wasn't as big of a deal because the armor had advanced so well that the traditional bows were actually not quite as good at penetrating the armor. So they didn't really have to worry about arrow fire so much. Yeah, it still hurt, but it wasn't going to kill you. So they focused more on, since their armor was getting so heavy, they let the shield get a little bit smaller and more maneuverable. And also from this time period, which unfortunately that picture didn't show up there, we start to see some of the first daggers. Kind of confounding that daggers were not, we always think of daggers as being like a really simple, very old weapon, but historically we don't see daggers showing up until relatively late in the period. So trust me, that was a very nice picture of a dagger there. Actually, it looked exactly like this. This is what's called a rondel dagger because it has this circular thing here called a rondel. Cover it. You'll notice that the blade is actually not very flat. It's rather triangular. It's because the armor is getting so good that you can't just slash through it anymore. Now you have to start trying to puncture through the armor. So you get weapons that are more suited for puncturing rather than slashing. And the daggers reflected that very well. So this is a rondel dagger. Now, like I said, the Yemen's foot soldiers did not fare very well at the Battle of Visby. However, in about 100 years later, we would have the foot soldiers doing quite well at the Battle of Granson, which happened on 1476. The Swiss were trying to stop someone from sending reinforcements to a castle that they had besieged. And the Swiss had tried something that was relatively groundbreaking at the time. They had fielded a bunch of foot soldiers because their cavalry couldn't make it there in time. So they had a bunch of foot soldiers. They looked exactly like that guy over there, wearing kettle hats, cloth garments, and carrying what was a brand new type of weapon at the time, the Swiss halberd. I have one back here. It's almost like a plan, that. There we go. Now, a halberd is a great weapon because it's 3 weapons put into one. It has a cutting side, a pointy side that could use like a spear, and a back spike. That way, in case you have someone riding towards you on horseback, you can actually kind of hook them and pull them down a little bit off their horse. They lose a little bit of their effectiveness. They, not all of it, the knights were still pretty dangerous on foot, but at least you had a little bit better chance. This apparently proved to be a very effective way of fighting because the Swiss halberds actually managed to stop several cavalry charges that the French had launched against them, which was unheard of at the time. I mean, cavalry were the dominant force in the battlefield. What were these goofballs with long sticks and axes doing stopping all these trained horsemen? What happened, interestingly enough, the battle ended when the French eventually decided, since they also had a brand new invention called artillery, that we're just going to pull our cavalry back and just blast them with artillery from the mountaintops, and that should break up their ranks a little bit. Unfortunately, it was a very poorly timed maneuver because the cavalry were withdrawing to make room for their artillery at the same time that the Swiss cavalry were arriving. So they assumed that they were retreating, they followed after them, and soundly defeated them before the artillery was ready to fire. But the important thing on the Battle of Granson, which you can see a nice image of in the next page, it looks uncannily similar to that one behind all the spears over there, is now the face of warfare is looking very different. What used to happen was a bunch of knights would be called by their lord into battle. If the lord wanted to wage warfare, he'd find all the people who had oaths of fealty to him and be like, hey, I need you to come fight for me. But the knight wouldn't come by himself. He would bring members of his estate to come fight with him, a bunch of commoners that he trusted. So he'd bring himself, he'd maybe bring a few commoners who were pretty decent horsemen to serve as extra cavalry. He'd maybe bring a few archers, maybe bring a few infantry people. And his whole household that came with him, that whole group was collectively known as a lance. So whenever you see accounts of battles, or medieval battles, they talk about how many lances were raised. And the lance, remember, was one knight and all the people that kind of came along with him. Of course, the archers were put in their own separate formation. The cavalry were in their formation, and infantry were in the formation. So they trained with their formation, but at the end of the day, when everything was over, all of the people would just go back to the household, to their night, and the other people that they spent their day-to-day lives with, and they would have supper and kind of, BS by the campfire with each other. Relatively similar to what we do today. With the people they knew from their household. That was how it worked when you were raising lances for that type of warfare. Now with the success of the Swiss halberdiers, we start to see people realizing, hey, there might be something to this whole infantry thing yet again. So kings realized that it would be much cheaper for them to hire a bunch of either a bunch of standing infantry or hire a bunch of mercenary infantry to fight for them, rather than having to worry about all these knights that are all over the place. So we're looking at the 15th century here in Grandson. We see lots of foot soldiers, lots of halberdiers. We see a few knights kind of fighting it out over there. You'll see the armor is a little bit more sophisticated than it was before. We're now officially into the era of full head-to-toe plate armor. So now we finally have our knight in shining armor, about a little less than 1,000 years after the concept of knight was even invented. Also, we're now into the Renaissance. So whenever we think of medieval knight in shining armor, we're actually thinking of a Renaissance knight. But now we get to see them. They have a special type of helmet called a sallet that has a tail to cover the back of your neck. Those helmets would get more advanced as time went on. And we even get to see, sure enough, cannons. They had gunpowder. Gunpowder was actually invented somewhere in the 14th century. They really didn't know how to use it for a while, and now finally in the 15th century, they have figured out how to make artillery cannons, and those were starting to replace trebuchets and catapults that they had before. Also, somewhere in this picture, I'm not exactly sure where, it's kind of like playing Where's Waldo in this particular illustration. They actually do have a very rudimentary firearm of the type that's hanging on the wall over there. It took 2 people to fire it, and I would imagine that it was not highly accurate. So, with the rise of the whole concept of the mercenary, people you could pay to fight in formation for you, we start getting mercenary guilds, basically organizations that would hire out their services to whoever paid them. And of them, one of the more famous ones was known as the Landsknecht, which was made up of mostly German and Swedish troops. No, sorry, not Swedish, Swiss troops, which are on the next slide. We actually see an illustration of a Landsknecht member marching somewhat nonchalantly to battle with his wife. The Landsknecht were a very powerful mercenary guild. They were very well known, very well represented, and very terrifying. They wanted to be recognized by people because they had such a ruthless reputation. So they wore these very bright, flamboyant colors in the battle, and they wore these big puff and slash garments that would make them easily noticeable, and their nice big fancy hats, of course. It was sometimes when people saw Landsknecht members, they were so scared of them they would actually just run away. Which, that's the easiest way to win a battle. It's to not fight at all. They had all sorts of weapons. Most of their weapons were designed to be fought on foot because they were primarily an infantry force. They had pikes, which are specialized spears that have a very long spears that have a very short, stout tip on them. Older spears had very wide tips with sharp bladed edges. Allowed them to be used as spears, but also to actually cut with them if you wanted to. You could actually think of them as very long knives at the edge of a pole. Now with the pike, we actually have, as you can see, a very stout point, very thick point that's more designed for thrusting than it is for cutting. Because the armor was getting too good for the cutting to be consistently effective throughout that time period. They also had pole arms, not as long mixed in with the pikes. They also had pole arms. These are, like I said before, any metal weapon mounted at the end of a long stick. It includes halberds, but also there are many different types being developed at this time. We have glaives and bills, for example. But they all have the same pattern. They all have a cutting edge, a sharp pointing edge to serve as a spear, and a back spike for grappling. So they all basically do the same thing. We also have the rise of the very large two-handed sword, which in Germany was called the Zweihander. Zweihander literally in German meaning 2 hands. These things were very large. The one on the bookshelf upstairs is actually a good example of a Saxon Zweihander. It's over 6 feet long. So if I were to stand that thing on its tip, it would be taller than I am. It weighs a little bit over 8 pounds. So these were sizable weapons. They were used, they were given to their very big men. They'd send them out ahead of the rank and file of the pike blocks to go and try and break up openings and make weaknesses in the enemy's pike block. And so they would get there a little bit before their comrades would, and they would just kind of hack and slash away, trying to either break the pikes themselves, push them aside to make an opening, or most preferably hit the person who's holding the pike in the first place. And then the rest of the pikes their allies would get there, and then they would have room to kind of weasel in and start fighting. It was a very dangerous position to be in, to be one of these Zweihander wielders, because you got stabbed a lot. If you were lucky enough to not get stabbed, and you made it back to the pay station, which of course you had to go to after battle, not before, you got double pay of everyone else. So, it's not all bad. Now, we have all these nice long weapons, big 6-foot swords, long, 15-foot pikes. We have these nice, 8-foot long bills and halberds and things like that. Most of the hafts are made of wood, so it's natural to expect that some of them will either get broken or dropped in the course of battle. You don't want to be left defenseless, so you bring a smaller weapon to back it up, something you can draw when your primary weapon goes down, and once again we defer to the classic sword, Katzbelger, which was a very common sword for them to use. It had this fancy S-shaped cross guard. It had sort of a big pear-shaped handle that had an iron cap at the end of it to counterbalance the weight of the blade. Very fast weapon, very good for close quarters fighting, which is what they were most likely doing if they had their Katzbelger out in the first place. And then of course they also had ranged units. They had bows and crossbows, which were then replaced by arquebusers, which were a very rudimentary type of firearm, kind of before the musket or the caliber would be invented. So all these things started kind of coming into place in the 15th and then into the 16th century. We are, of course, now into the Renaissance, moving closer to the early modern period. Some good examples of some equipment in the Renaissance is... well, that picture didn't turn out. Anyway, that was a rapier at one point. But, more importantly, I'd like to point your attention to this sword over there. Now, we had long swords. Long swords were basically the old medieval sword that used to be used in one hand with a shield or a buckler. Now the handle got longer and the blade got longer, so you could use it with two hands, but it was still light enough to be used one-handed if you had to. This was the long sword. Those long swords started off as being very wide-bladed for slashing attacks, but as armor got better, they got narrow and narrow and narrower till we got to an extreme, kind of like this one here. You can see that blade is very narrow, very thick, much more designed for puncturing things than it is for actually cutting things. This is an example of a good Renaissance type of longsword, or sometimes people will call these things estocks or tucks. Very thick, narrow swords designed for stabbing things. Since most of you already know what a rapier looks like, I'm not too terribly upset about this picture not turning out. But you can very easily see how that type of longsword could be, with only a few modifications, transitioned into a rapier, which is a very long, thin blade designed mainly for puncturing things. The difference is that the rapier was kind of designed for civilian use, so that when you were not in combat on a battlefield, but just walking around town. The reason for this is that the Renaissance was a very dangerous time. There were lots of political and religious turmoil going on, lots of assassinations happening all over the place. You didn't really, if you were a nobleman of any status whatsoever, you didn't want to go outside your doorstep unless you had some sort of armament on you. Hence, the rapier, which is this very slender, very elegant, befitting of a nobleman, but also a very effective weapon to use on the streets should you be ambushed by someone or should you be challenged to a duel there on the spot. Of course, when you have the nice graceful weapons, you also have the somewhat less graceful looking ones, so we also have a nice Gothic mace up there. Now, mace eventually was originally just kind of a club. Then they added a club with a rock in the end of it. And they started adding clubs with nails drilled into them. And they started making them entirely out of metal. And then they thought, wow, this is getting really heavy. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to make a metal rod, and then we're going to hand weld these flanges onto that, so that not only does you get more force with every power of your swing, but it's also much lighter than should that just be a solid block of metal. So there's a good example out here, which we'll have a chance to look at later on during the question and answer session, of a good Gothic or Renaissance flanged mace. So now we get to move on to the Battle of Jarnac, which is kind of in the middle of the 1500s. This is important because this is when a lot of historians like to put the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the early modern period. This was a religious war between the French Catholics versus the Huguenots, who were the French Protestants at the time. The battle itself is not all that important, but we do have a very relatively accurate illustration of it. Although, the war did continue on after the battle. We can see now our knights finally look like what we expect them to. They have their full, very highly developed, very artistic plate armor, similar to Max. This is the same time period that Max would have been created, so the fluted armor was popular here. This was about as good as metal armor was going to get, because their artistry with steel, their techniques were very, very well refined. They were very good at making these things. However, they were good because firearms were not yet very powerful. They did exist, but they were still in the process of getting better. They weren't very strong, meaning you didn't take a whole lot of steel to stop it. As the firearms got more powerful, they started making the armor thicker and thicker and thicker to stop the musket balls. Until 100 years later, in the 17th century, we're having armor that's actually literally 3 times as thick as it is right now, just to stop those musket balls. Because of that, well, before we move into that, let's take a very nice look at some very high quality armors and where we progress since then. On the next slide, I have 2 sets of armor. Now, both of these armors have actual people inside of them. This is important because when you go to a museum, you see armor hanging on something, kind of like this. Oops. This is nice. It gets you a chance to look at it, but it's it's kind of dead. You don't get to see how it actually fits on a person, real human body. So this is a good example of a nice late 14th or 15th century Gothic plate armor. You see he's got that sallet on there. He's got head to toe full plate armor. He still has that long hauberk. But he's pretty well protected. It fits him pretty well. That's a pretty good set of armor. But I gotta say that one's even better. That is the armor of Dr. Tobias Capwell, curator of the Royal Armoury in England. He literally wrote the book on English armor. He published a doctoral thesis on English armor. And he used his research to actually take measurements from his own body and designed a suit of armor that would be perfectly tailored to fit him, like they would have done back at the time period. As you can see, he was quite effective with it. It fits him very well. It almost looks like he's wearing a metal tuxedo. It's also, he painted it nice black and gold colors, which they did do back then. He does do some jousting in it, so it does hold up under pretty large amounts of stress. And he loves to explain to people how armor was not very cumbersome. He is quite good at his armor. He can do a 100-meter dash in his armor just fine. He can get up. He can lay down on the ground and get back up again. He can mount his horse one-handed, with 1 foot. He's quite happy to prove you wrong about any misconception you might have about armor. But since he's all the way over in England, I just had to show a picture and tell you about all these things instead. But anyway, he does have some good footage on YouTube if you want to check it out. It's pretty interesting. He does good stuff. So, like I said, this is as good as armor is going to get. After that, it starts getting thicker and heavier. When we move into the 17th century, the armor is so thick and heavy that it doesn't even pay to have a full set of plate armor on anymore. You can't move. So they get rid of the leg armor, they get rid of the arms, they change the helmet a little bit. The helmet becomes a little bit more like that Mauryan helm over there, which you might recognize because that's the same type of helmets the conquistadors would have worn when they came over and conquered Latin America. And the armor was more or less just reduced to a chest plate and maybe just a few segments or lames of plate to cover the tops of your thighs. Because you can wear some pretty thick armor around your torso without having to worry too much about mobility. You still can move your limbs around as much as you need to. And frankly, one of the places you don't want to get hit with a musket ball is, where your organs are. So it made sense to kind of shrink the armor at that time period. Here we have a good depiction of what's going on. Battle of Vienna in the 17th century. Vienna got besieged a lot of times. So this is just one particular time it happened. This was when the Ottoman Turks were were raiding and conquering all over Europe at the time period. They got so far as Vienna, Austria, actually, and they besieged the entire city. King Leopold managed to get out of the city before the siege was complete and requested help from John III, who was king of Poland at the time. So Poland sent about 30,000 people, and they actually were able to turn the tide of the battle and not only scare the Turks, break the siege of Vienna, but actually chase the Turks all the way back to what would become Turkey. The Turkish leader, Kara Mustafa, got blamed for the defeat, unfortunately, by the people of his homeland. They said that there was no way you should have lost that siege. You had 100,000 people against about 30,000. So we're going to execute you. They executed you by hanging him with a silk cord. And just a fun little historical side note, Kara Mustafa's last words to his executioner were, "Make sure you tie the knot right." So he didn't like to mess around too much. Anyway, so you're probably wondering what exactly could have turned the tide of the Battle of Vienna, even though when they're so grossly outnumbered. And I know none of you are going to believe me, but it was the Poles. The Polish people used to be, at this time period, were an almost unstoppable military force. And they looked more or less like the next slide here. This is real. I know you don't believe me yet, so I'm going to show you an actual picture of some museum armor from Warsaw. These are the Polish winged Husaria. They were kind of cavalry's last hurrah before a battle would once again in the early modern period fade into infantry fighting, where it would primarily stay for the rest of the Earth's history to the present day. Like I said, this is a time where people were wearing less and less armor because there was real bullets flying around out there. They couldn't, and you need really heavy armor to stop it. Poland said, "No, we're not going to do that. We're just going to put the heaviest armor we can find on." So they had these guys head to toe in full munitions grade armor. These people, by the way, were farmers that the King of Poland went out and recruited from the countryside and said, "Hey, you should come fight for us." So they trained them very well. They mounted them on horseback. They gave them a 20-foot lance, 2 different types of swords, because one wasn't enough apparently, and pistols to boot. So they're very much laden to the teeth. And then to top off the ensemble here, they put these very large wooden frames in their back and glued feathers to them to make them look like wings. And ipso facto, you have the Polish winged Husaria, which on the next page you can see an actual black and white picture of some armor that is on a museum in Warsaw there. They kind of came into being around the end of the 15th centuries, went into the 16th century, survived into the 17th for a while. The 16th century is really their glory years. The 17th century, they were still pretty powerful, but they were starting to decline a little bit. And this is what the king replaced his nobleman's levy with. So instead of calling on all of the people, all the knights that were supposed to serve him, he just had a standing army of these guys. And it was pretty effective. And I don't really know how you convince a farmer to put on all of this equipment and charge into the middle of battle on a horse when we're at a time period where there's muskets and calivers and cannons all over the place. But whatever they did, it worked. It worked quite well. And also, kind of an interesting thing, they also like to wear animal skins, just make themselves even more intimidating, if you can imagine that. This one appears to have a leopard skin of some sort around it. So, as you know, the 17th century is sort of the end of what the museum covers, because after that, the edged weapons sort of lose their effectiveness to gunpowder entirely, and the rest of history is dominated first by musket fighting, which, interestingly enough, was done in formation, because that's how it's been done for several hundred years. The musket fighting came directly from the pipelines that were developed during the Renaissance, from the mercenary guilds. And then, of course, once people realized that it didn't make a whole lot of sense to stand in a nice, neat square and shoot at each other, they started to use more modern types that were a little bit more guerrilla-esque, and eventually we have what we call modern warfare. Just a couple last notes about 2 important aspects of the battle, horses and artillery. on the other slide. We have horses obviously are very important. Both of these things have been around since the Roman times, so they're not exactly anything new. I just kind of saved them for the end of the part because I'm not exactly sure where else to put them. But the Romans weren't very big into mounted combat, but they did have chariots. They loved themselves some chariot racing. The Goths, on the other hand, loved to ride horseback, and that sentiment persisted through most of the Middle Ages. If you were a knight, you had lots of horses. There were actually several different classes of horses. You didn't just have one type of horse for everything. Most knights rode into battle on a very heavy draft horse, so that would be much more powerful, similar to this Clydesdale here. Those were called chargers. There are many different types of other types of horses that people use for various things, but I don't really have the time to go into that right now. But knights were expected to be excellent horsemen because they spent most of their time fighting on horseback. The way they got to be good horsemen was by growing up around horses, obviously, and also through big horseback par force hunting practices, which allowed them to test their horsemanship skills, because you're chasing a deer through rugged terrain all over the place. You have to be pretty good at managing your animal to be able to catch up with them. Kind of interesting, actually, medieval and Renaissance knights must have had like an entire barn full of animals, because you usually had at least one horse, more likely 2 or 3. You also had to have a falcon to go falconing with, because that was a very popular pastime. You need to have a greyhound for par force hunting. You need to have a spaniel for duck hunting. And you need to have a terrier to keep the rats away from all your grain. So these people were very, very closely tied to nature, and they did actually have a very good respect for it, and they had and also the sentiment that they felt for the land was also very strong. So while we like to look at how barbaric and everything was, the fighting and the politics that were going on, you got to remember that these people also did have a very large amount of respect for the natural areas. They didn't understand the natural areas quite well because they did hunt many animals to extinction, but it's most likely because they just didn't, they literally didn't think things would run out. So where horses were more of the era of the nobility, of the knights, the area of the commoners were the artillery, the siege engineers. The Romans did actually have some very early catapults. They called them onagers, which is Latin for mule, because they were so strong that the whole catapult would actually rock back and forth, and if you were standing too close to it, it would whack you in the face, and it felt like getting kicked like a mule, by a mule. So that was one thing. Most of those catapults were torsion drives, so they actually took 2 big ropes and twisted them up, wound them up really tight, and then pulled the catapult backwards, and then the ropes would twist even further, and then when they let go of it, the ropes would try and untwist, and that would throw the cup forward and whatever was inside of it. Eventually they designed these trebuchets here, which are very large counterweight catapults. So now you just have a very heavy weight on one end. You don't have that torsion, that rope-driven system anymore. These trebuchets got to be quite large. Also, interesting to note, trebuchets are a lot of times depicted as being mounted on castle walls to help fend off attackers. They actually couldn't put trebuchets on castle walls because these things rocked so much they could actually tear down the walls if you were not careful. So these were more of things that were brought in and assembled on site. The engineers would bring miniature models of catapults and trebuchets with them to the battle, take measurements on them, multiply them all by 10 or however big they wanted it, and use those measurements to cut and shape the real pieces of timber on site and assemble the catapults at the battlefield. We actually have an original our engineer's model of a catapult in that case back there. I believe I only know of 3 of those that are actually in existence, so we're very lucky to have that. So, that is very much the history of it. There's a lot to go into. Just very briefly, moving on to the next slide. Some of the stuff we like to think was lost. However, it did make some of a resurgence. It's not working. Oh. Well, that's unfortunate. Well, suffice it to say, what used to happen back then was people fought, people did different things. They did actually write some of the stuff down, different sword techniques they illustrated. They wrote down how things were done in battle onto the... actually, what you might do is try moving the cursor very far to the right and get it back on the screen, and then now hit the space bar. Anything? All right, well, there it is. Cool. So, Basically how a knight was trained, you started off as a little boy, about 8 or 9 years old. Your father would send you off to a good friend of his, preferably your maternal uncle. Since primogeniture went through the male, your maternal uncle was the safest person to send your son to train with because he most likely had no political motivations for assassinating an heir to the throne. So they were a popular choice. They go there. Also, the reason they didn't train their sons themselves is because combat was very trying. They wanted their sons to be prepared to face it, and they were afraid they would be too gentle on them, so they sent them to someone else. They began as children as a page. The page mostly got lessons from the knight in between and doing all the dirty work that the knight didn't want to do, like keeping his armor clean, sharpening his sword, feeding the horses, all the things like that. But he would get a good amount of training. Eventually, he would be so well trained that he could actually fight of his own volition. He would graduate to become what's known as a squire. This usually happened in his teens somewhere. So this pathway is actually very similar to an apprenticeship. In his teens, the knight would fight, not a knight yet, the squire would fight by himself, and he would basically stay a squire until people just generally felt like he did a good job upholding the chivalric ideals and performing well on the battlefield, that they wanted to honor him with the title of knighthood, which was done during a knighting ceremony, as most people are aware. This usually happened during adulthood. Some knights got knighted as early as their 20s, some didn't get knighted at all, some stayed squires their entire lives for various reasons. Usually a knighting meant that you're taking on more responsibilities, a lot of them financial, and a lot of knights a lot of squires weren't ready to handle that, so they would delay their knighting until they felt that they were ready. This is the way it was traditionally done. Later on, you actually did have martial arts teachers who would teach large schools of people how to do swordsmanship and how to fight, and these were called, in Germany anyway, Fechtschools, which were fight schools. There's been a movement the last 10 years or so. I'm trying to figure out how did this martial arts system actually work. This was proved rather, most of this happened because, we knew that had to be martial arts back then. You don't have a culture with as much fighting in it and not have some sort of system of fighting. That just doesn't make any sense. And mostly us Europeans must have been jealous of our Asian counterparts who actually had preserved their martial tradition through oral teachings and through a very strict system of master to student, and then people who could, they put a lot of stock in tracing who your teacher was through many generations. Europeans didn't have that. They kind of would work on something, and then when something better came along, they ditched the old system and go to the new system, and they wouldn't really continue that tradition for very long. However, a few of them had the foresight to actually write down and document how that fighting system worked in books and manuals. Most of these, of course, had to be hand-drawn, so they didn't happen very often. They were quite expensive until the printing press was invented. But we did manage modern people did manage to get a hold of a few of these things. They translated them to the best they could. They started experimenting, trying to figure out how things would work. Now, due to much experimentation and a lot of heated debates on how various things actually happened, we now actually have the beginning of some actual schools of European combat in this country and in many countries in Europe. Poland has a very active group, Germany has a very active group, and they're starting to actually train people from a younger level, very similar to what a Japanese dojo does. For whatever reason, most people do it, for personal growth and experience, things like that. Despite that, there's still a lot of self-teaching. You still have to do a lot of the research yourself. You need to look at the period manuals yourself, try and form your own opinions. I actually brought a few of the books that I use up on the front here. Those are just 5 of them from various people all over the world. Some from Poland, some are from Sweden, one guy's from New York. There's various people who have put a lot of research into this and have included the original manuscripts with the pictures and translations so people can draw their own conclusions. So that's how that works. There's actually several different traditions. So not only did we discover that there was a fighting system in Europe, there actually were more than one of them. For example, we have, in the German tradition, belonging to a master, on the next slide, known as Johannes Lichtenauer. Very well known, very high reputation for his time. He was in the mid to late 14th century. This is what we think might be a picture of him, but no one has been able to verify it yet. Well, of course, not a picture, but a drawing, painting, of him holding a practice sword. he has basically founded an entire tradition, very similar to what the old senseis would do. Many, many people to come in the later centuries would actually write, this is the ancient teaching passed down from the master of arms, Johannes Liechtenauer, in the German tradition, and so on and so forth, lots of other legal jargon that went in there. So you would actually have a line of succession, which kind of surprised people when they first found out about it. They didn't think anything like this actually existed in Europe, but it did. German tradition is very concerned with there's a set number of precepts and there's different concepts, and you have to know when to employ each concept in battle. And it also relies very heavily on the ideas of vor, nach, and indis, which one is before. Obviously, if you hit first, you'll probably win. One is nach, which means after. You don't want to be in that position. And indis, which means that if someone attacked you first, you need to, as soon as possible, gain the initiative back from them and start fighting on your own terms. So that's more or less how that worked. They actually, fun fact about the German fencing system, they did not have any blocks. They never blocked a sword. They would always attack back with another attack that would simultaneously stop the opponent's attack and threaten them with a brand new one at the same time. So as it was termed in the martial arts world, a one-action system, instead of a parry and riposte idea, which a lot of people have of sword fighting, which is a two-action system. So that was one. Another one is actually from their southern friends there, the Italians. The Italian tradition of Fiore dei Liberi grew up around the same time as Liechtenauer. In fact, they might have even talked to each other at some point. We're not sure. The exact dates of when these people lived is a little bit fuzzy still, but people are still working on it. He also taught a similar system using mostly longsword. The Italian system is called Flos Dueltorum, which is Latin for flower of combat, and it teaches that there's many ideas that kind of feed into one thing. It's actually a fairly similar system in many respects to the Germans, but they do have a little bit of differences. Fiore is famous for teaching the four ideas of battle being more of the things like, he signified them using animals. So like for strength, you had the elephant. For mindfulness, you had the leopard. For quickness, you had, I don't study Italian, so something else. But all these different animals to kind of say, these are all the things that you'll have to use in combat. And he would specify, usually he gave his instructions in sets of 4. So you'd be like, this is a counter that uses more of a strength technique, this is a counter that uses more of a quickness technique, this is a counter that uses more of a intelligence technique, things like that. So he did a lot of that. And for a long time now, there were just, we think, mainly these two traditions, and people learned either German school or Italian school, even if they were from these different countries. They may have had their own traditions, but unfortunately they weren't very well documented, so this is what we're kind of forced to believe. Of course, during the Renaissance, and the printing press, and the addition of the new weapon, the rapier, more and more people actually started learning, teaching different methods of combat, and all of a sudden you see this big explosion of all these different fencing systems that revolved around the rapier. You have the French, the Spanish, even the Hungarians got into it. They had the Hungarian cavalry saber, all these different things. However, there was actually one guy who kind of resisted the whole thing. And there was, of course, the English, because they're stubborn. Here we see George Silver, 16th century English gentleman. A little bit fuzzy about how he actually became to be a fencing master, because he seems to not have any training whatsoever, or at least none that we can document. But he did write 2 entire books on it. The first one is called Paradoxes of Defense, where he talks about how much the rapier sucks and how everyone should fight with big basket-hilt swords that were common in England during the 17th century. They have these big, broad, single-edged blades, and then they have a big cup that covers the hand. You might have seen them in some movies, historical movies somewhere along the way. Anyway, he taught that basically the rapiers were inferior to the English swords and that everyone should go back to using the English swords. He also hinted at an actual English martial arts system, but never actually explained it. Then he came back in his second book, Brief Instructions Upon My Paradoxes of Defense, where he actually talked about how the system worked. And he talked about true times versus false times, so his was very much a timing thing. What happens is if someone would attack you in a false time, you would counter them with a true time action, because the true time actions were always faster than the false time actions, and you should win the encounter. If someone uses a true time action, then there's actually a tiered system of which actions are faster than other ones in terms of the true time, so you just have to pick one farther up on the tier. So it's a very interesting way of looking at a very aesthetic system, which people don't usually exist in. People usually think of these concepts as being more Asian martial arts than European, but we do have documentation that they did exist. And silver is a popular fodder for many people who are getting into it as well. So I think we've gone from the Roman Empire to the modern era. I think that's plenty of time to discuss today. So I thank you all for coming. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and feel free to stick around, look around for a little bit, and I'll answer any questions that you want. And once again, thank you. Also, don't forget our gala, our anniversary gala is on May 11th. It's a big thing, it's practically an all-day thing. We'll have fight demonstrations, we'll have blacksmiths working here, we'll have refreshments, so it'll be open, museum will be open, we'll have period musicians from Winona. It'll be a big thing. I encourage you guys all to come. We have flyers that have the actual schedule of events going on, including presentations done down here in this theater that day. Those are upstairs at the front desk. If you're interested, feel free to take one of those with you as you leave so that you know what's all going on. So, all right.